But what my children didn't know was that the fragile old woman they'd been lecturing about realistic expectations had quietly amassed a real estate investment empire worth $6.8 million over 4 decades, and the Italian adventure I was about to embark on would teach them exactly why you should never mistake a grandmother's quiet lifestyle for limited resources or age for inability. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had family members try to limit your dreams because of your age. Make sure you're subscribed, because this story of how one 70-year-old woman's surprise trip to Tuscany turned her family's condescending assumptions into the most expensive lesson about respect and underestimation will leave you cheering. My name is Margaret Sullivan, and at 70 years old, I thought I'd experienced every possible variation of well-meaning but misguided family concern. I'd survived my husband Patrick's sudden death from a stroke 3 years ago, watching the man who'd been my partner in everything collapse in our garden while tending to the tomatoes he'd planted religiously every spring for 35 years. I'd navigated the brutal adjustment from being half of a lifelong partnership to being a widow in a world that seemed designed exclusively for couples. I'd even endured my daughter Linda's increasingly frequent suggestions that I might want to slow down, be more realistic about my capabilities, and act my age, instead of pursuing the travel dreams Patrick and I had nurtured throughout our 42-year marriage. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the carefully orchestrated family intervention that occurred during what should have been a pleasant Sunday dinner at Linda's sprawling suburban home in Highlands Ranch, Colorado, on a crisp March evening that would forever change how I viewed my relationship with my children. The ambush had been planned with military precision. Linda had strategically invited my son Michael and his wife Jessica, along with my youngest daughter Sarah and her husband David, creating what they undoubtedly believed was a supportive family environment for delivering some necessary truths about my post-retirement lifestyle choices. The dining room had been set with Linda's good china, the wedding set she usually reserved for Christmas and Easter, and she'd prepared my favorite meal of pot roast with roasted vegetables, clearly hoping that familiar comfort foods would soften the blow of whatever they were planning to discuss. I should have recognized the warning signs. The children had been unusually attentive during dinner, asking detailed questions about my daily routines, my social activities, my financial management, and my plans for the future. Michael had been particularly interested in whether I was staying busy enough, and if I felt secure living alone in the house Patrick and I had shared for over 3 decades. Sarah had made several comments about how different things were for women of my generation, how much more complicated travel had become since 9/11, and how dangerous the world seemed these days for vulnerable populations. Even Jessica, who usually remained diplomatically quiet during family discussions, had joined the conversation with questions about whether I'd considered downsizing my living situation, simplifying my financial arrangements, and accepting help with tasks that might be challenging for someone in my situation. My situation. That phrase had been circulating through our family conversations for months, always delivered with the kind of gentle concern that made it difficult to object without seeming ungrateful for their attention. But I was beginning to understand that my situation was code for something much more troubling than simple family concern about an aging parent. "Mom," Linda began after we'd finished dessert and moved to her living room, where she'd arranged the seating so that I was in the center chair facing a semicircle of concerned adult children and their spouses. She set down her coffee cup with the kind of deliberate precision that signaled she'd rehearsed this speech multiple times. "We've all been talking, and we're concerned about some of the ideas you've been sharing lately." "What ideas?" I asked, though I suspected I knew exactly what this intervention was targeting. "This whole Italy obsession," Michael jumped in, his voice carrying the patronizing tone he typically reserved for explaining technology to people he assumed were technologically challenged. "Mom, you're 70 years old. You've never traveled internationally alone. You don't speak Italian. You have no experience navigating foreign countries. You don't understand how different things are in Europe, especially for elderly Americans traveling solo. The Italy obsession. For 6 months, ever since I'd started researching the Tuscan cooking and art history tours that Patrick and I had planned to take for our 40th anniversary before his unexpected death, my children had been treating my travel aspirations like symptoms of some kind of late-onset delusion or dangerous midlife crisis. "I've been doing extensive research," I replied calmly, pulling out the folder of materials I'd brought specifically for this conversation. "I've found several wonderful small group tours specifically designed for mature travelers. The accommodations are excellent. The itineraries are carefully planned and manageable. The group sizes are limited to ensure personal attention, and the tour companies have decades of experience working with travelers of all ages and abilities." "Mom," Sarah interrupted, leaning forward with the expression of exaggerated patience she'd perfected during her years as an elementary school teacher. "You're talking about spending thousands and thousands of dollars on something that's completely impractical for someone in your situation. Think about what else you could do with that money. Home improvements, medical expenses, emergency funds for unexpected situations. Someone in my situation." There it was again, that phrase that had become my children's diplomatic way of saying that being 70 automatically meant I was physically incapable of boarding an airplane, intellectually incapable of navigating travel logistics that millions of people my age managed successfully every year, and financially irresponsible for wanting to spend my own money on experiences rather than hoarding it for hypothetical emergencies. "What situation is that exactly?" I asked, genuinely curious about how they perceived my current life circumstances. "You know what we mean, Mom," Jessica said, with the kind of gentle condescension that felt more insulting than outright rudeness. "You're a senior citizen who would be traveling alone to a foreign country where you don't speak the language, where you don't understand the customs, where you'd be vulnerable to any number of problems. What if something happens to you? What if you get lost or sick or confused? What if someone takes advantage of you? What if there's an emergency and we can't reach you or help you? What if? My children had become experts at imagining catastrophic scenarios that conveniently justified treating me like I was incompetent, rather than acknowledging that I might actually be capable of making intelligent decisions about how to spend my time and money. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but I think you're significantly underestimating my ability to handle travel arrangements and take care of myself in unfamiliar situations. I've been managing complex logistics for 70 years. I successfully raised 3 children, managed a household, worked part-time jobs, helped your father build his business, and navigated countless challenging situations throughout my adult life. But Mom, be realistic," Linda said, and I could hear 40 years of accumulated frustration in her voice. Frustration that seemed directed not at my travel plans specifically, but at my refusal to accept their assessment of my limitations. "You've lived in the same house for 35 years. You drive the same familiar routes to the same grocery store and the same church every week. You've never been on an airplane by yourself, never navigated an international airport, never dealt with foreign currency or language barriers. This isn't about underestimating you. It's about understanding your limitations and accepting reality." My limitations. According to my children, those limitations included being too old to learn new things, too fragile to handle unexpected situations, too naive to avoid being victimized by foreign criminals, too confused to navigate airport security or international customs, and too irresponsible to manage travel logistics without supervision. Besides, David added, clearly feeling obligated to contribute to what was obviously a coordinated presentation, wouldn't it be much more practical and sensible to take some nice day trips closer to home? Colorado has incredibly beautiful scenery. You could visit some local museums, maybe take an art appreciation class at the community center, or join a gardening club with other women your age. There are lots of age-appropriate activities that would be much safer and more realistic for someone in your stage of life. Age-appropriate activities. as if I was a toddler who needed to be given suitable toys rather than an adult who could choose her own adventures based on her own interests and desires. As if turning 70 meant I should automatically limit myself to pursuits deemed suitable for elderly people by younger family members who'd apparently appointed themselves as experts on what constituted reasonable behavior for someone my age. "I don't want to take pottery classes or join gardening clubs," I said firmly, feeling my patience beginning to fray despite my efforts to remain diplomatic. "I want to see Michelangelo's David in person. I want to eat authentic carbonara in a Roman trattoria. I want to walk through the same streets where Renaissance masters lived and worked. I want to visit the vineyards of Tuscany and taste wine made from grapes grown in soil that's been cultivated for thousands of years." Patrick and I planned this trip for years, researching every detail, saving money specifically for this adventure, and I want to take it in his memory and for my own fulfillment. "Mom," Michael said with a long sigh that suggested I was being unreasonably stubborn and refusing to accept obvious truths. "Dad's gone. Those dreams were for when you were younger and healthier and had someone to travel with, someone to help you if things went wrong. You need to accept that some things just aren't realistic anymore. You need to adjust your expectations to match your current circumstances." That was the moment I realized my children had fundamentally misunderstood who their mother was and what she was capable of accomplishing. They'd looked at my quiet lifestyle, my modest spending habits, my preference for familiar routines and simple pleasures, and concluded that I was someone who lacked the resources, intelligence, courage, or competence to pursue ambitious goals. They'd mistaken contentment for limitation, frugality for poverty, routine for inability, and age for automatic decline. "What if something goes wrong?" Sarah pressed on, apparently interpreting my silence as weakening resolve rather than growing determination. "What if you fall and break a hip in some remote Italian village where they don't speak English? What if you have a medical emergency and can't communicate with doctors? What if you get confused about your medications or your travel documents? What if someone steals your purse or your passport? You'd be completely helpless and thousands of miles away from anyone who could help you. Completely helpless." That phrase crystallized everything that had been bothering me about these conversations. My children had somehow convinced themselves that reaching the age of 70 automatically transformed a competent, intelligent woman into someone who needed constant protection and guidance from younger family members who presumably knew better about everything. "You're assuming I'm incompetent," I said quietly. "We're not assuming anything," Linda replied quickly. "We're just being realistic about the challenges of international travel for someone who's never done it before, especially someone who's what?" I interrupted. "Someone who's at a vulnerable stage of life," Jessica finished diplomatically. Vulnerable. There it was, the word that had been lurking underneath all of their careful euphemisms. In their minds, being 70 meant being vulnerable, which meant needing protection, which meant accepting limitations imposed by people who supposedly knew better. "I've survived 7 decades on this planet," I said, my voice gaining strength. "I've raised 3 children, buried both of my parents, watched my husband die in my arms, rebuilt my life as a widow, and managed every aspect of my personal, financial, and social affairs independently for the past 3 years. What exactly makes you think I'm suddenly incapable of handling a carefully planned trip to one of the safest, most tourist-friendly countries in the world?" "Mom, it's not about being incapable," Michael said, using the patient tone people employ when they think someone is missing an obvious point. "It's about being smart and practical. Why take unnecessary risks when there are so many safer alternatives? Why spend a fortune on something that could go wrong in a dozen different ways when you could have perfectly nice experiences much closer to home?" "Because," I said, finally allowing my frustration to show, "I don't want perfectly nice experiences close to home. I want the extraordinary experience that Patrick and I dreamed about for 20 years. I want to honor his memory by taking the trip we planned together. I want to prove to myself that his death doesn't mean the end of every dream we shared. The room fell silent. I could see my children exchanging glances, the kind of meaningful looks that suggested they'd anticipated this emotional argument and prepared responses for it. "Mom," Linda said gently, "we understand that you miss Dad and that you want to feel connected to him. But don't you think there are healthier ways to process your grief? Maybe you should talk to someone, a counselor or a grief support group, about these feelings instead of trying to recreate experiences that were meant to be shared." A counselor, a grief support group. More age-appropriate activities designed to help me process my emotions in ways that my children found acceptable and non-threatening. "I'm not trying to recreate anything," I said. "I'm trying to create something new. I'm trying to live fully and purposefully for whatever years I have left instead of shrinking into the small, safe life you seem to think is appropriate for someone my age." "But Mom," Sarah said, "you have to consider the financial implications. These luxury tours cost thousands of dollars. Shouldn't you be more conservative with your money at this stage of life? What if you need that money for medical expenses? Or long-term care? What if you outlive your savings?" The financial implications. This was perhaps the most insulting assumption of all, that I was some kind of financially naive widow who didn't understand the cost of travel or the importance of financial planning for my future needs. "I can afford it," I said simply. "Mom, we know you're managing okay on Dad's pension and Social Security," Michael said with the kind of gentle correction usually reserved for people who are confused about obvious facts. "But these tours cost $10,000 or $15,000. That's a huge chunk of your annual income. You'd be spending money you might desperately need later for practical purposes. Dad's pension and Social Security. They thought I was living on Patrick's modest teacher's pension and my Social Security benefits, scraping by on a fixed income. That made expensive travel an irresponsible luxury. They had no idea that the quiet woman they were lecturing about financial responsibility had been building something extraordinary for 4 decades while they assumed she was just existing on whatever minimal resources widowed women typically had access to. But what they didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask about despite 40-plus years of being my children, was that the realistic old woman they were trying to manage had actually been creating a substantial financial foundation while they assumed she was simply living paycheck to paycheck like so many other retirees. The intervention was about to backfire in ways they couldn't possibly anticipate, and their lesson in respecting their mother's autonomy was about to include a very expensive education in what happens when you underestimate someone who's spent 4 decades quietly building wealth through strategic investments, while her family assumed she was just getting by. The Italy trip was going to happen, but it wasn't going to be the budget-conscious group tour they'd been so worried about. It was going to be something much more spectacular. Something that would teach them exactly why you should never assume that a 70-year-old woman who chooses to live modestly is the same as a 70-year-old woman who has to live modestly. And it was going to start with a phone call that would change everything they thought they knew about their mother's capabilities, resources, and determination to live life on her own terms. The drive home from Linda's house that evening was one of the longest 20-minute journeys of my life. I sat in my car in the driveway for nearly an hour afterward, staring at the modest ranch-style home where Patrick and I had built our life together, trying to process what had just happened and what it revealed about how my own children perceived E. The house looked exactly the same as it had when I'd left for dinner. The same warm yellow siding Patrick had insisted would make it feel welcoming. The same carefully maintained garden where he'd spent countless hours nurturing vegetables. And flowers. The same front porch where we'd sat together on summer evenings planning our retirement dreams. But something fundamental had shifted during those 3 hours at Linda's dinner table, and I was beginning to understand that the problem wasn't my travel aspirations. It was my children's complete misunderstanding of who their mother actually was. Inside, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and settled into Patrick's favorite armchair. the worn leather recliner where he'd read his evening newspapers and watched his beloved Denver Broncos games. The house felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because I was seeing it through my children's eyes for the first time. They looked at this modest home and saw evidence of limited resources. They observed my careful spending habits and concluded I was financially constrained. They noticed my preference for routine and assumed I lacked the capability or confidence to handle new challenges. They'd constructed an entire narrative about my limitations based on surface observations, never bothering to ask deeper questions about my actual situation, resources, or capabilities. The truth was that Margaret Sullivan, the woman they'd just lectured about being realistic and age-appropriate, had been quietly building something extraordinary for 4 decades while they assumed she was just getting by on a teacher's pension and Social Security benefits. My story didn't begin at 70 as a vulnerable widow in need of protection and guidance. It began at 30 as Margaret Catherine O'Brien, a young woman with a degree in business administration from the University of Colorado and an absolute determination to never be financially dependent on anyone, including my beloved husband. When Patrick and I married in 1981, we were both starting teachers at different schools in the Denver public school system. Patrick taught high school history and coached basketball, while I taught business classes at the community college level. Our combined income was modest, but sufficient for a young couple with simple tastes and big dreams for the future. But I'd grown up watching my mother struggle financially after my father died in a construction accident when I was 16. I'd seen how quickly a family's security could disappear when they were dependent on a single income, and I'd promised myself that I would never be in a position where someone else's death or disability could destroy my financial stability. I want us to live on one income and invest the other, I told Patrick during our first year of marriage as we sat at our tiny kitchen table planning our budget. Not because we don't trust each other, but because I want us to have choices. I want us to be able to take risks, pursue opportunities, and weather any storms that come our way. Patrick, bless his heart, had complete faith in my financial instincts, even though he readily admitted that numbers and investment strategies made his head spin. "You handle the money, Maggie," he'd said, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. "I trust you completely to build whatever future you think we should have." That trust was the foundation of everything I accomplished over the next 4 decades. While Patrick focused on his teaching career and gradually earned his master's degree in education, I threw myself into understanding how money really worked. I read every financial publication I could find, studied successful investors, and learned about real estate, stocks, bonds, and business ownership. But more importantly, I started putting that knowledge into practice immediately. My first investment was a small duplex in a modest neighborhood near the University of Denver. The property was in decent condition but needed some cosmetic improvements, which kept the price reasonable for a young couple with limited cash for a down payment. Patrick and I did most of the renovation work ourselves during weekends and school breaks, painting, landscaping, updating fixtures, and learning basic home maintenance skills that would serve us well in future investments. "Are you sure about this, Maggie?" Patrick had asked as we signed the mortgage papers for that first property. "It seems like a lot of responsibility on top of our regular jobs." "I'm sure," I'd replied, though truthfully I was terrified and exhilarated, in equal measure. Real estate is the foundation of most family fortunes in America. If we can make this work, it's going to change our entire future. The duplex was a revelation. Not only did the rental income from one unit cover the mortgage payments for the entire property, but we were also building equity through appreciation and principal payments. Within 2 years, the property had increased in value enough for us to refinance and use the equity as a down payment for a second rental property. "This is incredible," Patrick said as we reviewed our financial statements at the end of our second year as landlords. "We're making money while we sleep." "This is just the beginning," I replied. already researching our next investment opportunity. Compound interest and real estate appreciation are the most powerful wealth-building tools available to regular people. We just have to be patient and consistent. Patience and consistency became the hallmarks of our investment strategy over the following decades. While other young couples our age were upgrading their cars, buying bigger houses, and spending money on luxury vacations, Patrick and I lived modestly and reinvested every dollar of profit from our growing real estate portfolio. By 1990, we owned 4 rental properties and had accumulated enough equity to make a much larger investment. A small apartment building with 6 units that was being sold by an elderly owner who was tired of managing tenants and maintenance issues. Margaret, the seller, a gentleman named Robert Chen, had said during our negotiations, "You remind me of myself 30 years ago. You understand that real estate isn't just about buying properties. It's about building systems that generate passive income for decades." "What do you mean?" I'd asked, eager to learn from someone who'd obviously been successful in real estate. "Investing. I mean that most people buy 1 or 2 rental properties and spend all their time and energy managing tenants, fixing problems, and dealing with day-to-day operational issues. But smart investors create systems that allow them to own many properties without being consumed by the management responsibilities." That conversation introduced me to the concept of professional property management, hiring experienced companies to handle tenant relations, maintenance coordination, rent collection, and all the operational aspects of real estate ownership. It was a revelation that transformed our investment strategy from a hands-on hobby into a scalable business model. "We can hire property management companies to handle everything," I explained to Patrick after meeting with several local firms. "Yes, it costs money, typically 8 to 10% of rental income, but it frees us to focus on acquiring more properties instead of managing the ones we already own." "And you think that math works out in our favor?" Patrick asked. "I think the math works out spectacularly in our favor. Instead of spending our weekends fixing toilets and dealing with tenant complaints, we can spend our time researching new investment opportunities, analyzing market trends, and building relationships with other real estate professionals." The transition to professional property management was another turning point in our wealth-building journey. Suddenly, we were real estate investors rather than landlords, focused on strategic growth rather than operational management. Throughout the 1990s, we systematically acquired rental properties across the Denver metropolitan area, always focusing on modest homes and small apartment buildings in stable neighborhoods with good schools and reliable employment bases. We avoided the temptation to buy expensive properties in trendy areas, instead targeting working-class neighborhoods where we could attract stable, long-term tenants who treated our properties with respect. "The key is cash flow," became my mantra. Every property has to generate positive cash flow after all expenses, including mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance, maintenance reserves, and management fees. If a property doesn't pay for itself and generate additional income, it's not an investment. It's a liability. Patrick often joked that I could evaluate a potential rental property faster than most people could decide what to order for lunch. I'd developed systems for quickly analyzing neighborhood demographics, school ratings, employment trends, crime statistics, and property tax assessments. I could walk through a house and estimate renovation costs, monthly rental potential, and long-term appreciation prospects within minutes. But our real breakthrough came in 1995, when I recognized an opportunity that would dramatically accelerate our wealth accumulation. The Denver area was experiencing significant population growth driven by the technology industry, but most real estate investors were focusing on residential properties. I noticed that small commercial properties, office buildings, retail spaces, and light industrial facilities were being overlooked by individual investors who found them intimidating or overly complex. Commercial real estate generates higher rental yields than residential properties, I explained to Patrick as I spread out financial projections for a small office building we were considering. business tenants typically sign longer leases, pay higher rents per square foot, and handle their own utilities and maintenance. Plus, commercial properties are valued based on their income generation rather than comparable sales, which means we can directly impact the property value by improving operations and increasing rents. But it's a much bigger investment, Patrick pointed out, and we don't know anything about managing commercial tenants. It's a bigger investment, but it's also a bigger opportunity, I replied. And we're not going to manage anything ourselves. We'll hire commercial property management companies just like we do with our residential properties. That first commercial property, a modest office building with 6 small suites occupied by local professionals like accountants, insurance agents, and marketing consultants, opened my eyes to an entirely different level of real estate investing. The cash flow was substantially higher than comparable residential investments. The tenants were more stable and professional, and the potential for value appreciation through operational improvements was much greater. Over the following decade, I gradually shifted our focus from residential to commercial real estate, selling some of our smaller residential properties to fund acquisitions of office buildings, retail centers, and warehouse facilities. By 2005, we owned a diversified portfolio of 17 properties generating substantial monthly cash flow and appreciating steadily in value. But the real test of our investment strategy came during the financial crisis of 2008-2009. While many real estate investors were forced into bankruptcy when property values plummeted and financing became unavailable, our conservative approach to leverage and our focus on cash flow rather than speculation allowed us to not only survive the crisis, but actually benefit from it. This is terrible for people who were depending on appreciation and refinancing to make their investments work, I told Patrick as we watched the news coverage of foreclosures and bankruptcies affecting real estate investors across the country. But it's a tremendous opportunity for people who have cash reserves and access to financing. During 2009 and 2010, we acquired 6 additional properties at dramatically below-market prices from distressed sellers who needed to liquidate quickly. These crisis purchases, made possible by the cash reserves we'd accumulated during the good years, became some of our most profitable investments as the market recovered over the following decade. By 2015, when Patrick was diagnosed with the heart condition that would eventually lead to his stroke, our real estate portfolio had grown to 23 properties with a combined value approaching $4 million. More importantly, the properties were generating enough rental income to support a very comfortable lifestyle without ever touching the principal or requiring Patrick and me to work past our planned retirement ages. "Maggie," Patrick had said during one of our final financial planning conversations before his death, "you've built something incredible. This portfolio is going to take care of you for the rest of your life, no matter what happens to me." "We built it together," I'd corrected him. "Your trust and support made all of this possible, but your vision and discipline made it happen," he'd replied. "Promise me that you'll use this security to live fully, not just safely. Don't let anyone convince you that having money means you have to be conservative about everything else in your life." Those words had stayed with me throughout the 3 years since his death, especially as my children began treating me like I was financially fragile and needed their guidance about major decisions. The truth was that 70-year-old Margaret Sullivan was worth approximately $6.8 million. The modest ranch house where I chose to continue living was paid off completely and worth about $400,000. The 23 rental properties were valued at just over $5.2 million with outstanding mortgages of only $800,000, meaning my equity position was approximately $4.4 million. The investment accounts Patrick and I had built alongside our real estate portfolio contained another $1.2 million in stocks, bonds, and cash reserves. Even more importantly, the rental income from my properties generated approximately $28,000 per month in cash flow after all expenses, property management fees, and mortgage payments. My annual income from investments alone was over $330,000, more than 10 times what my children assumed I was living on. I wasn't some struggling widow, scraping by on a teacher's pension and Social Security benefits. I was a successful real estate investor with enough passive income to live comfortably for the rest of my life while still building wealth for whatever legacy I chose to leave. But I'd chosen to live modestly, maintaining the same simple lifestyle. Patrick and I had always preferred, because contentment had never been about spending money for us. It had been about having choices, security, and the freedom to pursue our interests without financial constraints. My children had mistaken that modest lifestyle for financial limitation. They'd assumed that because I drove a 7-year-old Honda Civic, shopped at Target instead of expensive boutiques, and chose to stay in our family home rather than upgrading to some luxurious retirement community, I must be struggling financially. They'd never asked about my actual financial situation because they'd made assumptions based on surface observations. They'd never wondered how I could afford to help them with various expenses over the years, contribute to their children's college funds, and maintain a comfortable lifestyle without any apparent financial stress. Most importantly, they'd never considered that a woman who'd been making intelligent financial decisions for 40 years might actually know more about money management than they did, despite their attempts to guide and protect me from my own supposedly poor judgment. As I sat in Patrick's chair that evening, sipping my tea and processing the intervention I'd just endured, I realized that my children's concerns about my Italy trip weren't really about travel safety or age-appropriate activities. They were about control. They wanted to manage my choices and limit my options because they'd convinced themselves that I needed their protection and guidance. They'd created a narrative about my decline and vulnerability that justified treating me like I was incapable of making major decisions about my own life. But they'd picked the wrong woman to patronize and underestimate. The Italy trip was definitely going to happen, but it wasn't going to be the modest group tour they'd been so worried about. It was going to be something spectacular enough to teach them that their assumptions about their mother's capabilities and resources had been completely, embarrassingly wrong. And it was going to start with a phone call to my travel agent the very next morning. The phone call I made to Isabella Montenegro at Elite European Travel the next morning would set in motion a chain of events that would fundamentally alter my relationship with my children and teach them the most expensive lesson about assumptions they would ever receive. Isabella had been Patrick's and my travel agent for over 15 years, helping us plan the modest domestic vacations we'd taken throughout our marriage, carefully budgeted trips to national parks, historical sites, and scenic destinations that fit comfortably within our middle-class teacher lifestyle. What Isabella didn't know, because we'd never had reason to discuss it, was that our modest travel budget had been a choice rather than a limitation. "Mrs. Sullivan!" Isabella's warm voice carried her slight Italian accent, a legacy of her childhood, in Rome before her family immigrated to Denver when she was 12. "How wonderful to hear from you. Are you finally ready to start planning that Italian adventure you and Patrick always talked about?" "I am," I replied, settling into my home office chair and opening the folder of research I'd compiled over the past 6 months. "But I'm afraid my needs have changed somewhat since we last spoke." "Oh? How so?" "I'll be traveling alone, and I'd like to discuss some options that might be more substantial than the group tours we originally considered." Isabella's tone shifted slightly, becoming more professional and attentive. As one of Denver's most successful luxury travel specialists, she was adept at reading between the lines when clients hinted at different budget parameters. "Of course, Mrs. Sullivan. When you say more substantial, what exactly are you envisioning?" I took a deep breath, thinking about my children's intervention the previous evening and their assumption that I couldn't afford a basic tour package, let alone anything approaching luxury travel. "I want to rent a villa in Tuscany," I said. "Something spectacular, something that would be appropriate for a family vacation, even though it will just be me. I want to experience Italy the way wealthy people experience it, not as a budget-conscious tourist on a predetermined schedule." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Isabella had known Patrick and me as careful, modest travelers who always asked about discounts and off-season rates. This request represented a dramatic departure from our previous travel style. Mrs. Sullivan, may I ask what's prompted this change in your travel preferences? Let's just say I've decided to stop living smaller than necessary, I replied. I have the resources to travel in comfort and style, and I'm finally ready to use them. Wonderful, Isabella said, and I could hear the excitement building in her voice. Luxury travel planning was clearly her passion, and she was probably thrilled to have a client who wanted to explore high-end options. Tuscany has some absolutely incredible villa rental options. Are you thinking of a particular region? How long would you like to stay? And do you have any specific amenities or features that are important to you? I want to stay for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer if I'm enjoying myself. As for location, I'd prefer something within reasonable driving distance of Florence, Siena, and the major wine regions. I want to be able to take day trips to cities and cultural sites, but I also want a home base that's beautiful and peaceful. That sounds perfect. And in terms of amenities, I want a pool because I've always loved swimming and I want to be able to exercise comfortably. I want beautiful gardens because Patrick and I always dreamed of seeing Italian landscaping. Want a fully equipped kitchen because I'd like to take cooking classes and practice what I learn. And I want enough space to entertain because I'm thinking of inviting some friends to visit me during my stay. How many bedrooms would you need? I thought about this question carefully. My original plan had been a solo adventure, a chance to prove to myself and my children that I was capable of independent travel and cultural exploration. But as I considered the possibilities, a different idea began to take shape. 6 bedrooms, I said, surprising myself with the answer. Maybe 8, if the right property is available. 6 to 8 bedrooms, Isabella repeated. That's quite substantial. Are you planning to have many guests? Potentially, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was planning yet. An idea was forming, something that would address my children's concerns about solo travel, while also demonstrating exactly how wrong they'd been about my resources and capabilities. Mrs. Sullivan, I have to ask, and please don't take this the wrong way, but properties of that size in premium locations can be quite expensive. Are you prepared for rental costs that might range from $5,000 to $15,000 per week, depending on the specific property and season? $15,000 per week. I did quick mental math. For a month-long stay, that could be $60,000 just for accommodation, not including flights, meals, activities, or any other travel expenses. My children would be absolutely horrified by such expenditure, viewing it as financial irresponsibility bordering on insanity. Budget is not a constraint, I said calmly. I want you to show me the most beautiful, most impressive properties available. I want something that would take people's breath away. Isabella's excitement was practically tangible through the phone line. Mrs. Sullivan, this is going to be so much fun. I have access to some truly extraordinary properties through our luxury villa network. Let me put together a portfolio of options for you. Would you be available to meet this week to review possibilities? I'd prefer to do this as quickly as possible, I said. Could we meet tomorrow? Absolutely. How about tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock? That will give me time to compile a selection of stunning properties that meet your criteria. After hanging up with Isabella, I sat in my office looking at the family photos that covered my desk. Pictures of Linda, Michael, and Sarah at various stages of their lives, images of my grandchildren at holidays and birthdays, snapshots of family vacations and celebrations spanning decades. These people had spent an entire evening explaining to me why a basic tour of Italy was beyond my capabilities and resources. They were about to discover how wrong they'd been. But first, I needed to make another phone call. This one to someone who understood exactly what I was capable of accomplishing when properly motivated. Robert Chen had been my commercial real estate mentor for over 20 years, the man who'd introduced me to professional property management and taught me to think strategically about large-scale investments. At 78, he was still actively involved in real estate development projects, and we'd maintained a friendship built on mutual respect for each other's business acumen. "Margaret," Robert's voice was warm with genuine affection. "How are you doing? It's been too long since we've talked." "I'm doing well, Robert, but I'm calling because I need some advice about a rather unusual situation." "What kind of situation?" "My children have decided that I'm too old and incompetent to travel to Italy alone. They staged an intervention last night to convince me that international travel is beyond my capabilities and too expensive for my limited resources." Robert's laughter was rich and knowing. "Let me guess. They don't know about your real estate portfolio." "They have no idea. They think I'm living on Patrick's teacher pension and Social Security. They've been treating me like a financially struggling widow who needs their guidance and protection. And now you want to educate them?" "I want to do more than educate them. Robert, I want to demonstrate the difference between assumption and reality in a way they'll never forget." "What do you have in mind?" I explained my conversation with Isabella and my decision to rent a spectacular villa in Tuscany. "But I'm thinking about taking this a step further. What if I invited my entire family to join me in Italy for a week or two? What if I treated them to the kind of luxury vacation they assume I could never afford?" "That's brilliant," Robert said immediately. "Nothing teaches people about their misconceptions quite like experiencing the reality they thought was impossible. But I want to make sure I'm thinking about this correctly from a financial perspective. Is spending $100,000 or more on a family vacation a reasonable use of my resources? Margaret, your real estate portfolio generates more passive income in 3 months than most people earn in an entire year. You could spend $200,000 on this trip, and it wouldn't impact your long-term financial security in any meaningful way. More importantly, you'd be using your wealth to create memories and teach valuable lessons to people you love. You don't think it's frivolous or irresponsible? I think it's exactly what wealth is for, giving you choices and opportunities that wouldn't otherwise be available. You've spent 40 years building financial independence. Now use that independence to live fully and teach your children something important about assumptions and respect." Robert's perspective gave me the confidence to move forward with a plan that was becoming more ambitious by the hour. If my children thought I was too old and financially limited to travel independently, they were about to learn otherwise in the most spectacular way possible. The meeting with Isabella the next afternoon exceeded even my elevated expectations. She'd assembled a portfolio of 12 luxury villas, each more stunning than the last, complete with professional photographs, detailed amenity lists, and comprehensive information about surrounding attractions and activities. "This is Villa Serena," Isabella said, spreading glossy photographs across her conference table. "It's located in the hills between Florence and Siena, with panoramic views of vineyards and olive groves. 8 bedrooms, 10 bathrooms, infinity. Pool, professional kitchen, wine cellar, and formal gardens designed by the same landscape architect who worked on several famous Italian estates. The photographs were breathtaking. Stone terraces overlooking rolling Tuscan hills, elegant interior spaces that combined rustic charm with modern luxury, outdoor dining areas perfect for entertaining under the stars. The property includes daily housekeeping, a private chef available upon request, and concierge services for planning excursions and activities," Isabella continued. "The owners also maintain relationships with local wineries, cooking schools, and cultural sites, so they can arrange exclusive experiences that aren't available to typical tourists." "What's the rental cost?" I asked. "For peak season in September, it's $12,000 per week with a 2-week minimum. But Mrs. Sullivan, this property is usually booked years in advance. However, they've had a last-minute cancellation for the first 2 weeks of September, and they're willing to offer it at a slight discount, $10,000 per week, if you can commit quickly. $20,000 for 2 weeks, not including flights, meals, activities, or any other expenses. 6 months ago, I would have considered such an expenditure completely unreasonable. But that was before my children decided to stage an intervention about my supposed limitations. "I'll take it," I said without hesitation. Isabella's eyes widened, slightly. "Are you sure? Don't you want to review some of the other options first? The other properties are beautiful, but this one is perfect for what I have in mind. Please book it immediately." "Of course. How many guests should I plan for?" "Let's say 12 people maximum, including myself. I'm going to invite my family to join me for the second week of my stay." "Wonderful. And for flights? Our luxury travel department can arrange first-class accommodations to Rome or Florence. First-class flights to Italy for 12 people. And the cost was mounting rapidly, but so was my anticipation of my family's reaction when they realized what their financially limited mother was offering them. "Yes, please arrange first-class flights for 12 passengers to Florence, arriving September 14th and departing September 21st. I'll be traveling earlier to get settled before they arrive." "This is going to be an incredible trip," Isabella said, making notes and calculating preliminary costs. "Based on the villa rental, flights, and estimated expenses for activities and meals, you're looking at approximately $120,000 for the full experience." $120,000. 3 months of rental income from my property portfolio. A significant expenditure by any measure, but one that would create memories to last a lifetime while teaching my children the most important lesson they'd ever receive about making assumptions. "That sounds perfect," I said. "Let's make it happen." After leaving Isabella's office, I drove to my favorite coffee shop and sat in the corner booth where Patrick and I used to meet for our weekly financial planning discussions. Looking at the preliminary itinerary Isabella had provided, I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that I hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just a vacation, it was a statement about who I was and what I was capable of accomplishing. It was a demonstration that 70 years old didn't mean powerless, limited, or in need of protection. It was proof that a woman who'd built wealth through intelligence and discipline could use that wealth however she chose, regardless of what other people thought was appropriate for someone her age. But most importantly, it was an opportunity to share an incredible experience with the people I loved while teaching them to see me as I actually was, rather than as they assumed I should be. The question now was how to extend the invitation in a way that would maximize the impact of the revelation. I could simply tell them about the villa and invite them to join me, but that would give them time to process the information and potentially diminish the shock value of discovering their mother's true financial situation. Or I could wait until I was already in Italy, already living in luxury that they'd assumed was beyond my reach, and then invite them to experience something they'd thought was impossible for someone in my situation. The second option was definitely more dramatic, but it was also riskier. What if they couldn't get time off work on short notice? What if they refused to accept such an extravagant gift? What if they saw my invitation as some kind of manipulation, rather than a generous gesture? As I sat sipping my latte and watching Denver traffic through the coffee shop window, I realized that those concerns were exactly the kind of overthinking that had kept me living smaller than necessary for too long. My children had made assumptions about my limitations and capabilities. Now it was time for them to experience the reality of who their mother actually was. The invitations would be extended from Villa Serena, with photographs of me living in luxury they'd thought was impossible. They could accept or decline, but they would never again be able to assume that Margaret Sullivan was someone who needed their guidance about what was realistic or appropriate for her circumstances. The education was about to begin, and the first lesson would be delivered from a Tuscan villa that cost more per week than they assumed I had available to spend in an entire year. Italy couldn't come soon enough. The 2 weeks between booking my Italian villa and my departure date were a masterclass. in family manipulation disguised as caring concern. What I discovered during those 14 days revealed the full extent of my children's presumption about their right to control my life decisions, and it made my eventual response even more satisfying than I'd originally planned. It started innocuously enough. The morning after my meeting with Isabella, Linda called under the pretense of checking on my emotional state following our difficult but necessary conversation about my travel aspirations. "Mom, I hope you're not upset about yesterday evening," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of patient understanding that people use when they believe they've delivered unpleasant but important truths. "We only said those things because we love you and want to protect you from making decisions you might regret." "I'm not upset," I replied truthfully. "Actually, I found the conversation quite illuminating." "Good. I'm glad you're seeing it that way. Have you given any more thought to some of the local activities we discussed?" "I found a wonderful senior center program that offers day trips to art museums and historical sites. Much safer than international travel, and you'd be with a group of people your own age who understand your limitations." People my own age who understand my limitations. The phrase made my teeth clench, but I managed to keep my voice neutral. "Actually, Linda, I've decided to move forward with my Italy plans." There was a pause. "Mom, we talked about this. You agreed that it wasn't realistic." "I never agreed to anything. You and your siblings spent an evening explaining why you thought it was unrealistic. I listened politely, but I never agreed with your assessment." "But Mom, we went over all the reasons why it's not safe or practical. And I've decided that your concerns, while well-intentioned, are based on assumptions about my capabilities that I don't share." Another pause. Longer this time. "Mom, are you being stubborn just to prove a point? Because if you're doing this out of spite, that's not healthy for anyone." Stubborn. Spite. Apparently, any decision that contradicted my children's judgment must be motivated by character flaws rather than independent thinking. "I'm doing this because I want to go to Italy, Linda. It's that simple." "Well, if you're determined to be unreasonable about this, at least promise me you'll be sensible about the arrangements. Choose a reputable tour company. Stay in well-reviewed hotels, and make sure you have comprehensive travel insurance. I'll handle the arrangements appropriately," I said, which was absolutely true, though my definition of appropriately was going to differ dramatically from what she was imagining. That afternoon, Michael called with a different approach. "Mom, Linda told me you're still planning this Italy trip despite everything we discussed. I'm concerned that you might be making an emotional decision rather than a logical one." "What makes you think my decision is emotional rather than logical?" "Well, this whole thing started because you want to honor Dad's memory by taking the trip you'd planned together. That's understandable. But it's also an emotional response to grief rather than a practical assessment of what makes sense for your current situation." "Michael, your father and I researched this trip extensively. We saved money specifically for it. We planned every detail because it was important to both of us. Taking this trip isn't an emotional whim. It's the completion of a goal we worked toward for years. But Mom, Dad isn't here to help you if something goes wrong. You'd be completely on your own in a foreign country where you don't speak the language and don't understand the customs." "I'll be fine, Michael." "How can you be so confident about that? You've never done anything like this before. You might be surprised by what I'm capable of accomplishing when I set my mind to it." "Mom, I hope you're not planning to spend a lot of money on this. I know you want to honor Dad's memory, but he wouldn't want you to compromise your financial security for a vacation." There it was again, the assumption that I was financially vulnerable and needed guidance about spending decisions. The irony was almost overwhelming. "My finances are perfectly secure, Michael. This trip won't compromise anything." "But those tour packages can cost thousands of dollars, and you're living on a fixed income. What if you need that money for medical expenses or home repairs or other emergencies?" "I appreciate your concern, but my financial planning is more comprehensive than you realize." The phone calls continued throughout the week, each child taking turns to express variations of the same concerns. I was too old, too inexperienced, too financially limited, and too emotionally compromised by grief to make sound decisions about international travel. But the real violation of my autonomy began when they started going around me entirely. On Wednesday afternoon, I received a call from Dr. Patricia Williams, my primary care physician for the past 12 years. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind, but your daughter Linda called to discuss your travel plans. She's concerned that international travel might be too strenuous for someone your age, especially traveling alone. Dr. Williams, did Linda ask my permission before discussing my medical information with you?" "Well, no, but she's obviously concerned about your welfare. She wanted to know if I thought you were physically and mentally capable of handling the demands of international travel." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that based on your recent physical exam, you're in excellent health for a woman. Your age. Your blood pressure is well controlled, your cholesterol levels are good, and you have no medical conditions that would prevent you from traveling. I also mentioned that travel can be very beneficial for mental health and cognitive function in older adults. Thank you for that. But Margaret, I do want to make sure you're taking reasonable precautions. Have you considered traveling with a group rather than going alone?" Even my doctor had been influenced by Linda's suggestion that solo travel was inherently risky for someone my age. "Dr. Williams, millions of people my age travel internationally every year without incident. I'm planning to take reasonable precautions, but I don't need a chaperone." "Of course not. I just want to make sure you're being safe." The next violation came from my bank. On Thursday morning, I received a call from Janet Morrison, the personal banker who'd been handling my accounts for over 8 years. "Mrs. Sullivan, I hope you don't mind me calling, but your son Michael contacted us with some concerns about unusual activity on your account." "What kind of unusual activity?" "He mentioned that you might be planning to make some large expenditures for a vacation, and he wanted to make sure that you weren't being taken advantage of by scammers or high-pressure sales tactics." I felt my blood pressure rising. "Janet, Michael has no authority over my accounts. Why would you discuss my banking activity with him?" He said he was concerned about potential elder fraud, which is unfortunately very common. He wasn't asking for specific account information, just whether we'd noticed any suspicious transactions or communications. "My travel arrangements are legitimate and well-researched. I'm not being scammed or pressured by anyone." "Of course, Mrs. Sullivan. But if you are planning to make significant expenditures, I'd be happy to review the arrangements with you to make sure everything looks appropriate." "That won't be necessary, but thank you for the offer." The most egregious violation came on Friday afternoon, when I discovered that Sarah had contacted Elite European Travel directly. Isabella called me, her voice carefully professional but clearly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Sullivan, I received an unusual call today from someone claiming to be your daughter. She was asking questions about the travel arrangements we've been planning." "What kind of questions?" "She wanted to know how much you were planning to spend, whether we'd verified your ability to pay for the arrangements, and whether we thought the trip was appropriate for someone your age traveling alone." "I hope you told her that my travel arrangements are confidential." "I did. But I wanted you to know about the call in case it indicates some kind of family concern that might affect your travel plans." "Isabella, my family's concerns are based on assumptions about my age and capabilities that I don't share. Please proceed with all arrangements exactly as we've discussed." "Of course, Mrs. Sullivan. But if there are family issues, we should probably discuss whether you'd prefer to modify the arrangements in any way." "The only modification I want to make is adding travel insurance that covers family emergencies. If something happens that requires me to cut my trip short or change my plans, I want to be protected." "That's very wise. I'll add comprehensive coverage to your policy." By the weekend, it had become clear that my children weren't just expressing concerns about my travel plans. They were actively working to undermine my ability to make independent decisions. They'd contacted my doctor, my bank, and my travel agent, presumably hoping that these professionals would either discourage me from traveling or provide them with information they could use to demonstrate my supposed incompetence. The Sunday. Before my departure, Linda called with what she probably thought was a reasonable compromise. "Mom, we've been thinking about your Italy situation, and we've come up with a solution that might work for everyone." "What kind of solution?" "Michael and Jessica could arrange to meet you in Italy for part of your trip. That way, you wouldn't be traveling completely alone, and we'd feel better knowing someone was there to help if you needed anything." "Linda, I'm not traveling to Italy so that Michael and Jessica can babysit me. I'm traveling because I want to experience the country independently, at my own pace, according to my own interests." "But Mom, you have to admit it would be safer and more enjoyable to have family with you. Michael speaks some Italian from his college courses, and Jessica is very good at handling travel logistics." "I'm perfectly capable of handling my own travel. Logistics. Of course you are, but having help doesn't mean you're incompetent. It just means you're being practical about the challenges of international travel. The only challenge I'm facing is my family's assumption that I need supervision." "Mom, we're not trying to supervise you. We're trying to support you." "Linda, if you want to support me, respect my decision to travel independently and stop contacting my professional advisors behind my back." "We haven't contacted anyone behind your back. We've been reaching out to people who care about your welfare to make sure you're making informed decisions." "You contacted my doctor, my banker, and my travel agent without my permission. That's not support. It's interference." "Mom, we're just trying to make sure you're protected from making decisions you might regret." That phrase crystallized everything that had been bothering me about my children's behavior over the past 2 weeks. They weren't trying to protect me from external threats. They were trying to protect me from my own judgment. They'd decided that I lacked the competence to make major decisions about my own life, and they were prepared to go behind my back to prevent me from exercising independence they deemed inappropriate. "Linda," I said, "I want you to understand something very clearly. I am a 70-year-old woman with full control of my mental faculties, no cognitive impairment, excellent physical health, and significant life experience making complex decisions. I do not need protection from my own choices, and I do not need supervision from my adult children. Mom, we know you're capable. If you knew I was capable, you wouldn't be calling my professional advisors to express concerns about my decision-making. You wouldn't be suggesting that I need Michael and Jessica to accompany me. You wouldn't be treating this trip like evidence of poor judgment rather than evidence of independence and adventure. We just want what's best for you. What would be best for me is for my children to trust my judgment and respect my autonomy instead of treating me like I'm in cognitive decline." The conversation ended with Linda promising to back off while making it clear that she still thought I was making a mistake that would inevitably prove their concerns justified. That evening, as I finished packing for my departure the next morning, I reflected on everything that had happened since my family's intervention 2 weeks earlier. They hadn't just disagreed with my travel plans. They'd systematically attempted to undermine my ability to execute those plans independently. They'd contacted my doctor, hoping to get medical validation for their concerns about my physical and mental capacity. They'd contacted my bank, hoping to either prevent or monitor my financial transactions. They'd contacted my travel agent, hoping to either discourage my plans or gain information they could use to demonstrate the inappropriateness of my arrangements. Most importantly, they'd done all of this without my permission and then characterized their interference as support and protection. But what they didn't know, what they were about to discover in the most dramatic way possible, was that the vulnerable old woman they'd been trying to protect from her own poor judgment had actually planned something so spectacular that it would leave them speechless. Tomorrow morning, I would board a first-class flight to Florence. Tomorrow evening, I would arrive at Villa Serena, a luxury property that cost more per week than they assumed I spent in 6 months. Tomorrow, I would begin living in a style that would demonstrate exactly how wrong they'd been about my resources, my capabilities, and my judgment. And in 10 days, I would extend an invitation that would teach them the most expensive lesson about assumptions they would ever receive. The interference was about to backfire spectacularly, and the education was about to begin. The first-class cabin of Lufthansa, Flight 441 from Denver to Florence, was a revelation that set the tone for everything that would follow. As I settled into my spacious seat with its lie-flat bed configuration, personal entertainment system, and dedicated flight attendant, I realized that this was the first time in my 70 years that I'd allowed myself to travel in true luxury, rather than simply adequate comfort. The flight attendant, a sophisticated woman named Claudia who spoke impeccable English with a charming German accent, brought me a welcome glass of champagne and the dinner menu featuring options like lobster, medallions, and Wagyu beef tenderloin. "First time flying first class?" she asked with a warm smile, perhaps noticing my obvious appreciation for the amenities. "Yes," I admitted. "I'm celebrating a new chapter in my life." "How wonderful. Are you traveling for business or pleasure?" "Pure pleasure. I'm going to live in a Tuscan villa for 2 weeks and prove to my family that 70 years old doesn't mean powerless." Claudia's smile widened. "I have a feeling this is going to be a very successful trip for you." She was more right than she could have possibly imagined. 18 hours later, including a brief layover in Munich, I was standing in the marble-floored arrivals hall of Florence Airport, where a professionally dressed man holding a sign with my name was waiting to escort me to the private car service Isabella had arranged. "Signora Sullivan, welcome to Italia," said Marco, the driver, as he took my luggage and led me to a gleaming Mercedes sedan. "I hope your flight was comfortable. Villa Serena is approximately 1-hour drive through some of the most beautiful countryside in Tuscany." The drive was indeed spectacular. Rolling hills covered with vineyards and olive groves stretched to the horizon under a brilliant September sky. Ancient stone farmhouses dotted the landscape, and cypress trees lined winding roads that looked like postcards come to life. As we climbed higher into the hills, the views became even more breathtaking, and I found myself thinking that no group tour could have provided anything approaching this level of beauty and serenity. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for my first glimpse of Villa Serena. The property sat on a hilltop overlooking miles of vineyards and olive groves, its honey-colored stone walls and terracotta roof tiles glowing in the late afternoon sunlight. As Marco drove through the wrought iron gates and up the cypress-lined drive, I could see manicured gardens, a stunning infinity pool that seemed to disappear into the countryside beyond, and terraced outdoor dining areas that would have been suitable for a magazine photo shoot. "Madonna mia," I whispered, unconsciously reverting to one of the few Italian phrases I'd learned from my research. "Beautiful, no?" Marco said with obvious pride. "Villa Serena is considered one of the finest rental properties in all of Tuscany. You have chosen very well, Signora." The villa's property manager, an elegant woman named Francesca, who spoke flawless English, met us at the massive wooden front door. "Signora Sullivan, welcome to Villa Serena. I hope your journey was pleasant. Please, allow me to show you your home for the next 2 weeks." Home. For the next 2 weeks, this spectacular property would be entirely mine to enjoy however I chose. The interior was even more impressive than the photographs Isabella had shown me. Soaring ceilings with exposed wooden beams, antique furniture that belonged in museums, original artwork that I suspected was worth more than most people's houses, and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed views of the Tuscan countryside like living paintings. The villa has 8 bedrooms, each with private bathroom and unique views, Francesca explained as we toured the main floor. The kitchen is fully equipped for professional cooking, though our chef Giuseppe is available for any meals you prefer, not to prepare yourself. The wine cellar contains selections from the finest local vineyards, and the library has an extensive collection of books about Tuscan history and culture in both Italian and English. "This is incredible," I said, and I meant it. The villa was beyond anything I'd imagined when I'd told Isabella I wanted something spectacular. The staff includes daily housekeeping, grounds maintenance, and concierge services for any activities you wish to arrange, Francesca continued. We have relationships with the finest wineries, cooking schools, art galleries, and cultural sites in the region. Whatever you wish to experience, we can arrange. Actually, I do have one special request. I'd like to arrange for a professional photographer to take some pictures of me enjoying the villa and the surrounding area. High-quality images that really capture the beauty of this place. Of course, Signora. I know an excellent photographer who specializes in luxury travel photography. When would you like to schedule the session? Tomorrow afternoon, if possible. I want to document this experience thoroughly. After Francesca left, I walked through my temporary home in something approaching disbelief. The master bedroom suite was larger than my entire family room back in Denver, with a sitting area overlooking the pool and countryside. The bathroom featured a marble-soaking tub positioned so I could bathe while enjoying panoramic views of vineyards and olive groves. On the terrace outside the master bedroom, I found a bottle of Brunello di Montalcino and a selection of local cheeses and fruit, along with a handwritten note. "Welcome to Villa Serena, Signora Sullivan. We hope your stay exceeds your highest expectations. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask." I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into one of the comfortable lounge chairs, pulling out my phone to check messages. As expected, there were several texts from my children. Linda: "Mom, please let us know when you arrive safely. We're worried about you traveling alone." Michael: "Hope your flight went well. Remember to be careful with your belongings and don't trust strangers who approach you." Sarah: "Thinking about you today. Call when you get settled so we know you're okay." Their messages were caring but patronizing, full of the same assumptions about my vulnerability and incompetence that had motivated their intervention 3 weeks earlier. They were probably imagining me struggling with language barriers, getting lost in airports, or being overwhelmed by the complexities of international travel. They had no idea that their helpless mother was sitting on a terrace overlooking some of the most expensive real estate in Italy, sipping wine that cost more per bottle than they assumed I spent on groceries in a week. I typed a response to the group chat. "Arrived safely. Italy is beautiful. Having a wonderful time. Will call. Soon with updates." Then I put my phone away and focused on the incredible sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson above the Tuscan hills. The next morning, I woke up in the most comfortable bed I'd ever experienced, to the sound of birds singing and the distant bells of a village church. Giuseppe, the chef Francesca had mentioned, had prepared a breakfast of fresh fruit, local pastries, and the most perfectly prepared cappuccino I'd ever tasted, served on the terrace overlooking the pool. "Buongiorno, Signora Sullivan," Giuseppe said with a warm smile. "I hope you slept well. Today I have prepared some specialties from our region. This is pecorino cheese from local sheep. This bread is baked this morning in the village, and these figs come from our own trees." "This is incredible, Giuseppe. Thank you so much." "It is my pleasure. Tonight, if you wish, I can prepare a traditional Tuscan dinner. Perhaps ossobuco with Chianti wine reduction or wild boar ragu with fresh pasta?" "That sounds perfect." After breakfast, I spent the morning exploring the villa grounds and the surrounding countryside. The infinity pool was everything the photographs had promised, with views that stretched for miles across rolling hills covered with grapevines and olive trees. The gardens were manicured to perfection, with walking paths that led through aromatic herb gardens and ancient olive groves. But the real magic happened that afternoon when Alessandro, the photographer Francesca had arranged, arrived to document my experience. Alessandro was a sophisticated man in his 40s who'd photographed luxury travel experiences for international magazines and high-end travel companies. He understood immediately what I wanted to accomplish. "Signora Sullivan, I understand you want images that capture not just the beauty of Villa Serena, but the joy and sophistication of your experience here. Yes? Exactly. I want pictures that show a confident, capable woman living fully and beautifully, not someone who should be worried about travel being too challenging for her age. Perfetto. Let us create some magic. For the next 3 hours, Alessandro photographed me in various locations around the villa and grounds, sitting by the pool with a glass of wine and a view of the countryside, walking through the olive groves, in a flowing sundress that captured the golden afternoon light, preparing fresh pasta in the villa's professional kitchen with Giuseppe's guidance, reading on the terrace surrounded by the luxury and beauty of the property. These are some of the most joyful photographs I have taken in years, Alessandro said, as we reviewed the images on his camera. You radiate happiness and confidence. Whoever sees these pictures will understand immediately that you are living your best life. That's exactly what I hoped for. May I ask why these photographs are so important to you? Because I want to prove to some people who care about me that their assumptions about my limitations were completely wrong. Alessandro smiled. I think these photographs will prove that very effectively. That evening, as I enjoyed Giuseppe's incredible osso buco on the terrace under a canopy of stars, I composed the message that would change everything my children thought they knew about their mother. I selected the most stunning photographs from Alessandro's session, images of me looking radiant and confident in surroundings that were obviously luxurious and expensive. Then I crafted the message that would accompany my invitation. Dear Linda, Michael, and Sarah, I wanted to share some pictures from my first few days in Italy. As you can see, your concerns about my ability to handle international travel were unnecessary. I'm having a wonderful time and managing quite well on my own. I'm currently staying at Villa Serena, a property in the hills between Florence and Siena. It's even more beautiful than I'd hoped, and I'm enjoying every moment of this adventure. I've been thinking about our conversation 3 weeks ago, and I realize there are some things about my situation that you may not fully understand. Rather than trying to explain in a message, I'd like to invite all of you, spouses and grandchildren included, to join me here in Italy for the second week of my stay. I've arranged for first-class flights for everyone, departing Denver on September 14th and returning September 21st. I've also reserved the entire villa for that week, so we'll have plenty of space for the whole family to stay together. Consider this my treat. Flights, accommodation, meals, and activities are all covered. All you need to bring are your passports and vacation clothes. I know this is short notice, but I think it would be wonderful to share this experience with all of you. Plus, it will give us a chance to have some important conversations about assumptions, capabilities, and the difference between appearance and reality. Please let me know as soon as possible if you can arrange time off work. I'm very excited about the possibility of seeing you all in Italy. With love and anticipation, Mom, Grandma, Margaret P.S. Linda, you mentioned that Michael speaks some Italian from college. That might come in handy, though the villa staff all speak excellent English. And Jessica, your travel logistics skills won't be needed. I've handled all the arrangements myself. P.P.S. The villa rental is $12,000 per week, in case you're wondering about the financial implications of this invitation. I attached the most stunning photographs Alessandro had taken, images that showed me looking happy, confident, and surrounded by obvious luxury, and sent the message to the family group chat. Then I poured myself another glass of the exceptional Brunello di Montalcino and settled back to watch the stars emerge over the Tuscan countryside while I waited for their responses. The first reply came within 10 minutes from Michael. Mom? What is this? Where did you get the money for this kind of trip? Linda was next. Mother, please call me immediately. We need to discuss what's happening here. Sarah's response was the most succinct. OMG, Mom, how is this possible? Over the next hour, my phone rang constantly. I let the calls go to voicemail while I finished my dinner and wine. enjoying the growing hysteria in their messages as they tried to process the reality of their financially limited mother, living in luxury they'd assumed was completely beyond her reach. Finally, I called Linda back. "Mom, what is going on?" She practically shouted into the phone. "How can you possibly afford this? Did you take out loans? Are you spending your life savings? Have you lost your mind?" "Linda, I can afford this easily because I have considerably more resources than you've ever bothered to ask about." "What do you mean more resources?" "I mean that your father and I built a real estate investment portfolio worth approximately $6.8 million over the past 40 years. I mean that my rental properties generate about $28,000 per month in passive income. I mean that this trip represents about 3 months of income from investments you didn't know I had." Silence. "You're worth almost $7 million? Linda's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes. And before you ask why I never told you, the answer is simple. You never asked. You made assumptions about my financial situation based on my modest lifestyle, and you used those assumptions to justify treating me like I needed guidance and protection. But why do you live so simply if you have that much money? Because wealth isn't about impressing people or spending money unnecessarily. It's about having choices. And right now, I'm choosing to use some of my wealth to teach my children an important lesson about making assumptions." "What lesson?" "The lesson that you should never mistake someone's choice to live quietly for inability to live boldly. The lesson that 70 years old doesn't automatically mean limited or incompetent. The lesson that you should ask questions before making judgments about other people's capabilities." More silence. "So this invitation to Italy is real?" "Completely real. First-class flights for 12 people, a week at Villa Serena, all meals and activities covered." "But Linda, this isn't just a vacation invitation. It's a demonstration. I want you and Michael and Sarah to experience what your vulnerable, financially limited mother is actually capable of providing when she chooses to." "Mom, we never meant to make you feel like we thought you were incompetent." "Linda, in the past 3 weeks, you contacted my doctor, my banker, and my travel agent behind my back to express concerns about my decision-making. Michael suggested that I needed supervision from him and Jessica. Sarah implied that I was being irresponsible with money I couldn't afford to spend. How is that not treating me like I'm incompetent? We were trying to protect you. You were trying to control me based on assumptions that were completely wrong. And now you're experiencing the consequences of those assumptions." The conversation continued for another hour, with Linda alternating between shock, embarrassment, and excitement about the Italy invitation. Similar conversations followed with Michael and Sarah, each of them struggling to reconcile the modest lifestyle they'd observed with the financial reality I was revealing. But the most satisfying conversation was with my grandson Jake, who was 17 and absolutely thrilled about the prospect of a luxury vacation in Italy. "Grandma, this is insane," he said with the kind of genuine enthusiasm that reminded me why I'd always enjoyed his company. "You're like some kind of secret millionaire. This is going to be the coolest vacation ever." "Jake, I want you to remember something about this trip. Your grandmother didn't suddenly become wealthy last week. I've been building this financial security for decades, while your parents assumed I was struggling to get by on Social Security. The only thing that changed is that I finally decided to stop hiding my light under a bushel." "What does that mean?" "It means that sometimes people are much more capable and resourceful than they appear. It means that you should never underestimate someone based on age, appearance, or lifestyle choices. And it means that your grandma is going to show all of you how to live fully and beautifully, regardless of what anyone else thinks is appropriate." By the end of the week, all 12 family members had arranged time off work and confirmed their availability for the Italy trip. The logistics of first-class flights, villa accommodation, and activity planning were complex, but Isabella's luxury travel team handled everything with the kind of professional competence that only significant financial resources can command. 10. Days into my stay at Villa Serena, I stood on the terrace overlooking the Tuscan countryside, sipping my morning cappuccino and reviewing the final arrangements for my family's arrival. The villa staff had prepared all 8 bedrooms, Giuseppe had planned elaborate welcome dinners featuring local specialties, and the concierge had arranged private tours of Florence, wine tastings at exclusive vineyards, and cooking classes with renowned local chefs. The cost of this family vacation would exceed $120,000, representing less than 4 months of my rental income and a tiny fraction of my overall net worth. But the value of the lesson it would teach was incalculable. My children would never again assume that Margaret Sullivan needed their guidance about financial decisions. They would never again treat my travel aspirations as evidence of poor judgment or unrealistic expectations. They would never again contact my professional advisors behind my back to express concerns about my competence. Most importantly, they would understand that age doesn't automatically equal limitation, that modest living doesn't indicate poverty, and that their mother was far more capable and resourceful than they'd ever imagined. That afternoon, as the first Mercedes arrived, with Linda's family, I watched from the villa's grand entrance as my daughter stepped out of the car and saw Villa Serena for the first time. Her expression of absolute shock and disbelief was worth every penny of the $120,000 this demonstration was costing. "Mom," she said as she walked up the cypress-lined drive, looking around at the manicured gardens, infinity pool, and panoramic countryside views. "This is unbelievable." "This is what happens when you stop making assumptions and start asking questions," I replied, giving her a hug before leading her inside to see the rest of her accommodations. Over the next 7 days, I watched my family experience luxury they'd never imagined their modest mother could provide. They swam in the infinity pool while looking out over miles of vineyards. They dined on Giuseppe's incredible cuisine while watching spectacular sunsets paint the Tuscan sky. They toured private wine cellars and participated in exclusive cooking classes and visited world-famous art collections that were normally closed to the public. But more than the luxury, they experienced a completely different version of their mother and grandmother. They saw me confidently navigating Italian culture, communicating effectively with local professionals, and managing complex logistics with the kind of competence they'd assumed I lacked. On our final evening together, as we sat on the terrace, sharing Giuseppe's farewell dinner under a canopy of stars, Michael raised his wine glass in a toast. "To Mom," he said, "who taught us the most important lesson we've ever learned about making assumptions." "What lesson is that?" I asked. "That we should never underestimate you again," Linda added. "And that we should ask questions before making judgments about anyone's capabilities." "Most importantly," Sarah said, "that our mother is the most remarkable woman we know, and we're incredibly lucky to be your children." As we flew back to Denver in first class a few days later, my family still somewhat dazed by the experience they'd just had, I reflected on what this adventure had accomplished. I'd proven to myself that 70 years old didn't mean the end of adventure or the beginning of limitation. I'd demonstrated to my children that their assumptions about my capabilities and resources had been completely wrong. I'd created memories that would last a lifetime while teaching lessons that would benefit our family relationships for years to come. But most importantly, I'd remembered who I really was underneath the modest lifestyle and quiet routine I'd chosen for myself. I was Margaret Sullivan, a woman who'd built wealth through intelligence and discipline, who'd survived challenges and setbacks with grace and determination, and who was still capable of bold action and spectacular adventure when properly motivated. 6. Months later, I moved out of the family home in suburban Denver and into a beautiful condominium in downtown Florence. Not Italy, but Florence, Colorado, a charming mountain town that offered cultural attractions, outdoor activities, and a community of interesting people who appreciated independent thinking and adventurous spirits. My children visit regularly, but they no longer offer unsolicited advice about my lifestyle choices or financial decisions. They've learned to see me as I actually am rather than as they assumed I should be. And every year, we take a family vacation together, sometimes to Europe, sometimes to Asia, sometimes to exotic locations none of us had ever imagined visiting. These trips are my treat, funded by rental income from properties my children are finally learning to appreciate as evidence of their mother's business acumen, rather than mysterious windfalls they can't understand. The Italy adventure taught us all that age is just a number, that assumptions can be expensive, and that the people we love are often far more remarkable than we realize when we take the time to look beyond surface appearances. But most importantly, it taught me that it's never too late to stop living smaller than necessary and start embracing the full magnitude of what's possible when you refuse to accept other people's limitations as your own. The villa in Tuscany was just the beginning. At 73, I'm just getting started.